Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I never thought it would come to this, but here I am making an entirely positive video about Justin Bieber. For the sake of history, Justin Bieber is a 17-year-old Canadian pop singer who has attracted quite a substantial following, especially among many young people. I have never listened to a single work of Justin Bieber's, so I cannot comment on its musical quality. However, given my own tastes, given that I am an admirer of primarily classical music and a composer of classical music, I would suspect that Justin Bieber's musical direction and mine are quite different. Nonetheless, what drew me to comment on him is not his music, but rather comments that he recently made on a radio show with regard to S-978, a proposed bill by Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. It is called the Commercial Felony Streaming Act, and Bieber had not heard of either the bill or the senator prior to that radio show. When the host explained it to him, however, his reaction was quite strong. He said that Senator Klobuchar should be locked away and put in cuffs. And given the story of Justin Bieber's own rise to fame, that reaction is quite understandable, and, in my view, quite proper. The way Justin Bieber became famous was by singing other people's songs, without their permission. He was a young teenager, around 13 years old, who liked to sing, and who wanted to share his singing with others. So he made videos and put them on YouTube, and there he was discovered by an agent named Scooter Braun in 2008, who then distributed his work to a wider audience. Were that activity that Justin Bieber engaged in a criminal felony, he might not be a famous multimillionaire today, he might be behind bars. Now, when Senator Klobuchar's office was notified of Bieber's comments, the senator's staff responded that Bieber had misunderstood the bill. And I think that irrespective of the senator's intent, Bieber's fear of what this bill would do and his interpretation of what it would do is actually correct. Now let's look just a little bit at the provisions of this bill. The bill essentially targets the streaming of copyrighted material for the purpose of so-called commercial advantage or personal financial gain. And it imposes a penalty on that activity of up to 5 years of prison time. Previously, that kind of activity was and still is, because the bill is not yet law, considered a misdemeanor. So one could be fined, for instance, for a violation. However, with a felony designation, a lot of one's liberty could be taken away. 5 years of freedom, completely lost, and for what? It sets up thresholds defining what illegal streaming is. Illegal streaming has to occur 10 or more times within a 180-day period, and the value of the streamed material has to be in excess of $2,500, or the licensing fees for that material have to be over $5,000. Now, those are actually very flimsy thresholds because under current copyright law, they could be breached extremely easily. For instance, some might interpret streaming as a person clicking the play button on a YouTube video. So if a YouTube video gets viewed 10 or more times, that could be a violation of the number of times threshold. And furthermore, we've seen in court awards of damages on copyright infringement suits that if people who illegally downloaded 20 songs could be slapped with fines of several $100,000 per song, then clearly $2,500 is nothing. So there is a lot of danger to ordinary people from this bill. And furthermore, while Senator Klobuchar may not intend to target aspiring teenage pop stars like Justin Bieber, to criminalize the pursuit of commercial advantage or personal financial gain from streaming of copyrighted material wouldn't necessarily protect Justin Bieber, because irrespective of the intent of the authors of the bill, once it becomes law, and once it becomes the province of the court system, attorneys working on behalf of well-funded record labels, the same ones that have evinced a pattern time and again of persecuting ordinary people in order to prevent competition against their own particular services, these attorneys will interpret commercial advantage and personal financial gain more broadly than Senator Klobuchar might think. For instance, they could form a class action lawsuit against Justin Bieber now that he has all these millions of dollars on behalf of artists who are clients of those record labels, saying that Justin Bieber sang the songs of those artists without their authorization, and the copyright of the songs is actually held by the record labels. So, Justin Bieber would not have earned all that money were it not for his singing of all of these songs that led to his discovery by Scooter Braun. And as a result, these artists are all owed damages from Justin Bieber as a result of Justin Bieber's tremendous commercial gain. And so Justin Bieber has to pay up to the record labels that hold the copyright to those songs. It's an argument that many a shyster lawyer would make if that lawyer is working on behalf of a well-funded record label that is paying him millions of dollars to make that argument. It's a problem with our legal system today, where values such as justice and objectivity and a single true meaning of a legal text are trumped by, essentially, connections and political privilege of certain economic entities that try to subvert the free market and the rights of individuals for their own monopoly or quasi-monopoly powers. So there is a lot of danger to that. And Justin Bieber's comments, irrespective of whether he intended them to anticipate that danger, I think are indeed prescient. Now, with respect to Justin Bieber's own attitude toward the streaming of copyrighted material, I think it's quite admirable. Justin Bieber doesn't consider it infringement if a person sings another artist's song. Indeed, he considers it a compliment. He said in that same radio show that he regularly visits YouTube specifically to see if other people are singing his own songs, and that he is gratified when they do. He is flattered when they do, and if you listen to the audio clip of the interview, it's quite evident in his voice and demeanor that that is the attitude that he holds. And it's quite a breath of fresh air compared to popular musicians in previous generations, such as the artist formerly known as the artist formerly known as Prince, or Gene Simmons, who have both launched virulent attacks against so-called piracy and copyright infringement. My supposition is that Justin Bieber probably wouldn't go so far as to oppose copyright altogether, that he would simply confine the scope of copyright enforcement to what he thinks would be common sense boundaries, and as someone who is younger and more attuned to the possibilities of electronic technologies, Justin Bieber understands that singing somebody else's song on YouTube shouldn't be punishable by law. In his words, these are just people who like to sing. And naturally, he's bewildered by proposals to put people like that in jail. However, technically under copyright law today, using your own voice to sing somebody else's song which is copyrighted would be considered an act of infringement and could subject you to statutory damages which could run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, because that's the way they're defined under the law, irrespective of the actual economic harm that your performance inflicted upon the author of the song. The law just says, quite arbitrarily in many states, that every act of infringement shall be deemed to cause an economic harm of X $100,000. And in many cases, even the court's hands are tied. A judge cannot waive that statutory penalty because he doesn't have that authority under the law. He has to enforce the law as written. So this is the mess we're in today. And someone like Justin Bieber, who hasn't participated in the creation of these abominable laws, would naturally be outraged. And his comments are a reflection of that outrage. Now, while Justin Bieber is not a classical composer, his attitude actually has a lot in common with that of many classical composers prior to the age of copyright. During the 18th century in continental Europe, there was no copyright law. And one of the greatest compliments one composer could pay to another is to imitate that composer's work. Indeed, there are many pieces from the 18th century where the melody is essentially the same, but one could find that melody under the names of Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel, and one would find for each composer a different orchestration or different variations on the same theme. And it really led to a flowering of musical variety, with many classical composers making a good living. The most prolific composer of all time, Georg Philipp Telemann, existed prior to the age of copyright. No composer, even up to our time, has created more compositions than Telemann. And Telemann made a very good living from his work. On the contrary, in the post-copyright era, high classical music had stagnated for a while during the 20th century. Even though there were some promising musical developments and composers who were extremely talented, very often other composers feared to emulate them because they could be accused of copyright infringement. And as a result, the 20th century is generally not seen as the greatest era for classical music. We still consider the greatest composers today, at least according to the majority of public opinion, to be people like Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, who all composed prior to the copyright age. So maybe Justin Bieber should take his opposition to the Commercial Felony Streaming Act a bit further and turn it into an opposition to all copyright law. In particular, a paper that provides excellent fundamental reading on the subject is Against Intellectual Property by Stefan Kinsella. Kinsella makes the argument that intellectual property is not true property, that it is essentially a grant of monopoly privilege by governments, and unlike physical, tangible property, which arises by virtue of natural scarcity, intellectual property is an imposition of artificial scarcity on patterns of data that are potentially indefinitely reproducible. And if one person reproduces a pattern of data, that does not take away the existence of that pattern of data from another person. And as a result, that other person is no poorer. He still has everything he had originally. And the free dissemination of ideas can only make us all better off, as history shows with the development of classical music. It's actually quite amusing to see what happened to many composers who were on the cusp of the copyright revolution in the late 19th century. Giuseppe Verdi, a great Italian opera composer, was quite prolific in his early days, but once he was given copyright to all of his work, when copyright law came into effect, he stopped composing altogether, and he just lived off of the royalties of his earlier work. So, while proponents of intellectual property laws believe that those laws are necessary to encourage innovation, we see historically that's not the case. Very often they discourage innovation. And indeed, in our time, the proliferation of workarounds to the copyright system, such as the Creative Commons license, the GNU Free Documentation license, and open source software have shown that intellectual property, patents, copyrights is not necessary to promote innovation, and very often to get around the morass created by current intellectual property laws, individuals specifically have to designate their products as shareable. Now, a good intermediate step for Justin Bieber might be to support the concept of Creative Commons, because if he were to license his work as Creative Commons and encourage other artists to do that, that could create a vast revolution in public opinion with regard to the desirability of doing that. Irrespective of what his musical talents might be, Justin Bieber has a large following. What he says, irrespective of what his motivations for saying it are, is quite influential. When he speaks, people listen. And as a result, I think this is a great opening for him to educate himself more on this subject and turn his very proper emotional reaction against the Commercial Felony Streaming Act into a genuine revolution in the way music and musical innovation are treated in the Western world today.